Hello and welcome everybody to the first episode of what I'm calling Drawing in the Background. So I am a background designer in animation. I also teach at CGMA. I teach it's kind of a perspective for BG design class. This video in particular would be great for people during week 3 of my perspective class, where we were first starting to talk about how to set up 2-point perspective shots. All right, so for episode 1, I want to show you how I designed this kind of dungeon castle background around this animated clip. Now, I've on my own time kind of been experimenting with getting better at 2D animations, but I'm not going to talk at all about how I animated her because I really know very little about animation. But I am going to show you how I designed that background around her. All right, now let's get started. So here we have the project. At this point, I just have the character animated, and I'm just gonna start drawing a frame around her to figure out where I wanna put the background. Luckily, I matted her out with a white so that she will pop out from the background, which will make it a little easier to draw around her. And to start with, this is just kind of almost like a thumbnail stage where I'm just kind of scribbling out the general perspective so I can get a better idea of how I wanna set up the camera, what I wanna put in there. But I wouldn't even call this like a rough stage. This is like a pre-rough stage where I'm really just kind of figuring out the camera shot. And now from that, we can extend the canvas and start to figure out the perspective. To figure out the perspective, the best way is just to start drawing lines off of your sketch, kind of see where they converge. And that'll kind of tell you where your eye level should be. And then on that same eye level, you can plot out your other vanishing point. This particular demo, we're just going to be doing a simple 2-point perspective setup. I'm not going to get too complicated with it. And really the important thing with 2-point is to make sure that your vanishing points are far enough apart. If they're too close together, you're going to get weird distortion. In my class, I discuss a little bit about how different perspective setups will get you different camera effects based on how close the vanishing points are together. But kind of a rule of thumb is just make sure that they're wide enough apart where it's about the length of your canvas and then another half a length of your canvas. And that's usually a safe distance without getting into the cone of vision stuff. All right, so now I'm just kind of organizing my layers a little bit and I'm gonna start the actual rough. And now that I have the perspective to work off of, that's gonna make it a lot easier to make sure that the rough is nice and accurate and feels like it's in a concrete space. So we're just doing these really quick, just kind of sketching out areas. When I go to clean it up, I can refine some of that, but really just to get the basic composition, make sure that things feel like they're converging correctly. I know I'm gonna want some kind of stones on the ground, and that back hallway will have some cool little nooks. I'm just copying and pasting since we're gonna redraw it anyways. Let's put some skulls in there, that'd be fun. All right, we're just about done. I think we have a pretty good idea of what we want to do. This composition I was trying to get done in just a couple hours, so I didn't really labor the design too much. It's more just about getting something that's going to work for this particular shot. And I wanted a nice foreground element. What that does is it kind of helps push the viewer's eyes back towards the character. It's really easy in compositions for the character's eyes to kind of get stuck in the corners, so this will help a little bit with that and really try to point you right to where we want you to look. Cool, and right there, if you notice, the sword tangents that pillar, which I don't want. So I'm going back and adjusting some things a little bit to see if I can give that character a little more room to act without interfering and creating bad tangents. Cool, now that we're done with that, we don't need to see the large canvas, so I'm gonna shrink that down. I like to make my rough layer blue, so when I draw on top of it, the rough doesn't get, I don't get confused with the final line work. And then I'm just gonna start cleaning it up on some new layers. I'm gonna start with that column just because getting that to feel right with all those ellipses is going to be crucial to kind of making everything else work correctly. So sometimes I'll just start with kind of the hardest part that I want to nail. And I'm not going to over labor this drawing. I'm going to keep it pretty simple just to get it done quickly. and just kind of indicate some of that brickwork. This is a tricky part just because each row of bricks is basically a ellipse that's slightly more open than the previous. And so kind of laying it in is important. And it's a little bit off perspective, but I think it kind of works for this style to kind of push some of those curves a little bit more than they would be if I was going for like a hyper realistic style. So I think it'll work. All right, I'm gonna throw in those stairs. The important thing with stairs when you're dealing with perspective is if the stairs are below your eye level, you're gonna see the top surface of them. If they're above your eye level, you just see the side. So once you pass the threshold of the eye level with stairs, they get really simple to draw. But if they are below the eye level, we definitely do need to see a little bit of that top plane, which you can see in those top two steps. I'm gonna throw in a little candle on the side. I think later on I might animate that fire just so it all feels like it's moving. And at this stage, I'm just throwing in some brick patterns. I don't want to go overboard and draw every single brick like I did with the column. I'm going to keep the walls a little sparse, just enough bricks to kind of, for you to get the idea of what's going on. I'm also playing around with like having varying sizes of stones in that wall. So little bricks and big bricks, just to kind of make the design a little more interesting. All right, working on those nooks. It's in the background, so there's even less detail. I'm just trying to kind of indicate it. There's lots of kind of broken lines and where the corners are open. We don't really need to draw every single line to be completely closed off. We can keep it pretty simple, like a pencil sketch. I think I'm using a pencil brush, which has kind of a cool look to it and definitely helps make it work when you're doing a simpler background design. All right, just throwing it in there. I use very few layers at this stage. I'm kind of keeping it all together, especially when you're doing scenes like this where there's like weird brickwork and everything kind of overlaps everything else. Sometimes it's easier to keep the layers to a minimum just so you have a lot of freedom to erase and draw over things as needed, and you're not tied down to figuring out like which layer you're on so that you can delete the proper layer. That can become kind of a nightmare. But for this stuff, now that I'm adding some extra stuff on top of the wall, that will be on a new layer. And so I'm gonna have some chains, and maybe there were people tied up to these chains a long time ago, so there's a couple bones laying around, and I'm gonna put some skulls in those nooks. Some bad stuff probably was going down in this dungeon a long time ago. And going into this, I didn't really have a concrete idea of exactly what I wanted to. I just wanted to, get in there and draw. I knew the basic environment, so a lot of this stuff I'm thinking of as I'm going. Now, if you're working on a production, you'd have pre-designs and you'd have scripts and storyboards, and you'd have a lot more to work with. But if we're doing something like this, where it's just a fun little one-off drawing, you can have fun with it and put whatever you want. And in the process of drawing this, I realized how much of kind of the Cuphead style has been embedded into my brain. And just as I'm trying to draw quickly, a lot of that style technique is kind of coming out in this background. All right, for the foreground, let's draw on some of these details. I used a slightly larger brush just so that it pops out a little bit. But once again, we're keeping the details really minor, just enough so that it kind of reads what it is. But we definitely don't want this foreground element to be any kind of a focal area. It's made just to help push the viewer towards the character, and so that your viewer's eyes don't get trapped in the corner. Add some spider webs. Make it feel like it's been abandoned for a long time. I don't know what business she has down here. All right, you also notice that I'm drawing it completely zoomed out. If I had more time, I might zoom in on areas and really refine it, but for this particular video, I just wanted to keep this drawing really simple, try to get through it in a couple hours and not over labor it, so I'm not really zooming in a lot, just keeping it really fast. Sometimes for this style it kind of works too, because I kind of want that feeling like it's just a pencil drawing. I don't want to get too crazy with the details. In the past I've done some backgrounds where they're like hyper detailed, and you know, I'll spend 10+ hours on each one, but for this particular case we wanted it really simple. That way it'll match the rough character, since I didn't really clean up that animation too much. And I think at this stage also I kind of just flattened all the walls into one layer just so that it was really easy to quickly draw and erase in those tiles on the ground. I didn't want to draw every single tile, kind of like with the walls. I wanted to keep it sparse so that visually it would read what the floor felt like, but it wouldn't get, you know, it wouldn't become a distraction or interfere too much with the character, so that, you know, visually it would kind of breathe. But I found it a lot easier just to collapse those layers so that I could draw on top of anything and not have to worry about finding which layer it was on to delete it and then go back and draw it more. These took a little bit of time. They're pretty simple, and as long as they vaguely follow the perspective, they usually work. But a lot of times you draw one in and then it's like, nah, it's not quite right, and then you'll put one somewhere else, or just kind of keep adding to it till it feels right. There's not really a hardline rule of how to approach this type of kind of pattern where not every brick is drawn, but it's kind of here and there. All right, now that the line work's pretty much done, it's time to add some quick tone. I'm going to keep it pretty simple, just enough so we add a little bit of light and shadow. So first I'm going to draw a matte underneath that foreground so that we can just group it and darken it up a little bit. And then once we get to the stage, it's also nice to just add a little bit of a black border so that we're visually not distracted by things that are bleeding outside of the actual image you'll see. But it is good to draw outside of your actual frame, just in case you need to shift things around. That's why I'll always have a nice border around my drawings. Nice thing with Clip Studio is, since I'm using the same pencils for the animation as the background, I can meld it in and have background elements that you can't tell that they're going to be animated because I'm using the exact same brushes. So that torch is a good example of that. Adding a little bit of a gradient around the corners just to make it feel like there's really limited light and things are quickly dropping off as they go away from that light source. So sometimes a little gradient on the ground can just help quickly throw in a little sense of ambient occlusion. I don't want things to get too dark because I want it to feel, you know, easy to see the character. And I don't want to feel like I need to light the character. I want to keep it pretty simple on this first video. So we're just adding in some shadows and highlights on top of everything, or on top of the tone. Just enough to kind of indicate what the light might be doing. I think in the future, if I went in, it'd be fun to paint this, and maybe then I'd push the lighting a little bit more, but for this stage, we'll just keep it really simple. It'll go with the really simple character. All right, and now we're done. See it all together. She grabs the sword, it swings around, you'll see the torch is flickering. And so that's how I add a background to an animated character. Now, typically, if you were on a production, you would not animate a character and then decide to draw a background around it. You would be working off of storyboards, so everybody's on the same page. But for this particular example, since it's from a personal project, that's exactly how I did it. I did this all in Clip Paint Studio, and for most of my career, I've been using Photoshop, but Clip Paint Studio has some really cool animation tools in it where I can basically use the same brushes to animate the characters as I would draw the backgrounds, and it has a really cool look to it. So the last couple months, I've been using Clip Paint Studio a lot on my tablet computer. This is the first video, obviously. Hopefully you learned something from it, and thanks for watching.